What is now known as Angkor began as far more than just a simple city in Southeast Asia. Located in a strategic region of present-day Cambodia, surrounded by dense forests and close to the Tonle Sap Lake, Angkor emerged as the beating heart of one of the most powerful empires in medieval history, the Khmer Empire. Its rise was not sudden, but the result of centuries of political evolution, technological innovation, and territorial control that transformed an agricultural region into an unprecedented urban center for its time. In the beginning, small settlements were scattered across the fertile plains, sustained by natural cycles of flooding and drought. But over time, local leaders began to recognize something crucial: controlling water meant controlling life. From this realization, one of the largest hydraulic engineering systems in ancient history began to take shape. Canals, massive reservoirs, and irrigation networks were built, allowing continuous rice cultivation even outside natural growing seasons. This advancement transformed the region's economic foundation, creating agricultural surpluses capable of supporting a growing population and, more importantly, an expanding political and religious elite. The consolidation of this power began to take form in the 9th century, when rulers such as Jayavarman II established the ideological foundations of the empire by declaring himself a Devaraja, or God King. This fusion between political authority and divinity created a highly centralized system, where the ruler's power was legitimized both by force and religion. From that moment on, Angkor ceased to be merely an administrative center and became a physical symbol of divine power on earth. Over the centuries, successive kings expanded this model, investing not only in infrastructure but also in religious monuments that reflected their authority. Temples began to rise as representations of the cosmos, with elevated structures symbolizing Mount Meru, the center of the universe in Hindu and later Buddhist cosmology. These temples were not just places of worship, but also political, economic, and social hubs. Workers, priests, artisans, and soldiers constantly moved through these spaces, creating a highly complex urban dynamic. The city began to expand horizontally, connecting different areas through elevated roads and canals. Unlike many compact ancient cities, Angkor developed as a vast urban network spread across hundreds of square kilometers, something that would only be fully understood centuries later with modern technology. By the 11th and early 12th centuries, this expansion reached a new level. Rulers began investing in even more ambitious constructions, both in scale and complexity. This period marked Angkor's transition from a powerful capital into one of the largest cities in the pre-industrial world. The population grew rapidly, drawn by stability, food abundance, and opportunities within the empire. Merchants traveled along routes that connected Angkor to other parts of Asia, bringing goods, ideas, and cultural influences that further enriched the city. At the same time, the hydraulic system continued to expand and become more sophisticated. Massive reservoirs, known as barrages, stored enormous volumes of water, allowing precise control of water flow throughout the year. This level of control not only sustained agriculture, but also protected the city from droughts and floods, ensuring a level of stability that was rare for the time. This mastery over the natural environment was one of the key factors that allowed Angkor to reach its peak around 1200 AD. At that moment, the city was not just large, it was extraordinarily advanced. Its infrastructure, organization, and scale surpassed many contemporary cities in other parts of the world. Angkor had become a true urban machine, capable of sustaining a massive population and an ever-expanding empire. And all of it was built on a simple yet powerful principle: absolute control over natural resources, combined with a centralized political and religious vision. This combination of factors set the stage for what would come next, the absolute peak of Angkor as one of the most extraordinary cities ever created by humanity. At the beginning of the 13th century, Angkor had reached a level of development that few cities in history could match. Around 1200 AD, it was not just the capital of an empire. Angkor was one of the largest and most sophisticated urban areas on the planet, spanning hundreds of square kilometers and possibly supporting a population of hundreds of thousands. This monumental scale was not accidental, but the result of a combination of urban planning, advanced engineering, and a highly organized political structure. At the center of this urban system stood Angkor Wat, one of the most impressive constructions ever built by human hands. Constructed in the early 12th century during the reign of Suryavarman II, the temple was not merely a place of worship, but a physical representation of the universe according to Hindu cosmology. Its towers symbolized Mount Meru, while its corridors and bas-reliefs depicted mythological stories and military campaigns, reinforcing the connection between divine power and royal authority. Surrounding Angkor Wat, the city expanded in every direction, connected by an impressive network of elevated roads and canals. Further north stood Angkor Thom, a walled city built later that functioned as an even more complex political and administrative center. Its massive walls and monumental gates, decorated with carved stone faces, conveyed a sense of absolute power and constant surveillance. Within Angkor Thom, temples such as the Bayon stood out with their towers covered in human faces, possibly representing the king himself as a divine figure watching over his empire. But the true secret behind Angkor's greatness was not just in its temples, but in what lay between them. Unlike compact cities, Angkor was a dispersed metropolis where residential areas, agricultural fields, and religious centers coexisted in an integrated system. Wooden houses, now vanished, housed much of the population, while bustling markets connected rural producers with artisans and merchants. The economy was primarily sustained by rice production, made possible by an extremely sophisticated hydraulic system. Massive reservoirs, such as the bares, stored water during the rainy season and redistributed throughout the year through carefully planned canals. This system allowed multiple harvests annually, something rare at the time, ensuring food abundance and social stability. This ability to control the natural environment placed Angkor in a unique position. While other civilizations depended directly on climate conditions, the Khmer Empire had created a form of engineering of survival, where water was manipulated on a massive scale to sustain a large population. This control also enabled the mobilization of enormous labor forces for construction projects, resulting in temples, roads, and infrastructures that continued to expand the city. At the same time, Angkor's society was highly structured. At the top stood the king, considered a divine figure, followed by an elite of priests, administrators, and military leaders. Below them, a vast population of farmers, artisans, and builders maintained the city's daily operations. This hierarchy was reinforced not only by force, but by a complex network of religious beliefs that legitimized central authority. Hinduism, dominant for much of this period, began to coexist with Buddhism, reflecting
cultural shifts that would intensify in the centuries to come. Daily life in Angkor was dynamic and interconnected. Pilgrims visited temples, merchants traded goods from distant regions, and religious ceremonies shaped the rhythm of the city. At the same time, the empire maintained trade and diplomatic relations with other Asian powers, extending its influence beyond its borders. This combination of political power, economic wealth, and cultural sophistication transformed Angkor into one of the most important centers of the medieval world. Around 1200 AD, the city represented the absolute peak of the Khmer Empire, an urban system operating with remarkable precision, sustained by engineering, religion, and social organization. However, the same complexity that enabled its rise also began to create hidden vulnerabilities. The extreme dependence on the hydraulic system, religious transformations, and external pressures would gradually begin to alter the balance that sustained Angkor. What once seemed like an unshakable empire was slowly entering a phase of transformation and eventually decline. As the 13th century progressed, what had once seemed like a perfectly balanced system in Angkor began to reveal subtle signs of strain. The very model that sustained the city's grandeur, highly centralized, dependent on massive engineering, and deeply tied to the divine authority of the king, started to become vulnerable in the face of accumulating changes over time. The first major axis of transformation came from within the political structure itself. After the peak achieved under rulers such as Suryavarman II and later Jayavarman VII, the empire began to struggle to maintain the same level of stability. Jayavarman VII, in particular, had overseen one of the greatest expansions in Angkor's history, building temples, hospitals, roads, and administrative centers on an unprecedented scale. However, this level of investment required an enormous burden on the population, both in labor and resources. Over time, this model began to generate internal strain. The succession of rulers after this period failed to maintain the same level of control and strategic vision. Internal disputes, possible conflicts among elites, and administrative challenges began to fragment central authority. At the same time, a second factor began to deeply reshape the identity of the city religious transformation. For centuries, power in Angkor had been strongly tied to Hinduism and the concept of the king as a divine figure. However, from the late 10th century onward, and throughout the 13th century, Buddhism, particularly Theravada Buddhism, began to spread more widely among the population. Unlike the previous model, Theravada Buddhism did not emphasize the king as a divine being, but rather a more individual and spiritual approach to existence. This shift had profound implications. It weakened the ideological foundation that supported the absolute power of rulers, reducing their ability to mobilize large labor forces for monumental projects. The construction of massive temples slowed, and the focus began to shift towards simpler and more decentralized religious practices. Meanwhile, the hydraulic system, the functional core of Angkor, began to face increasing challenges. For centuries, the city had depended on a delicate balance between water capture, storage, and distribution. However, evidence suggests that significant climate changes may have occurred during this period, including prolonged droughts interspersed with intense rainfall. These extreme events placed stress on the existing infrastructure. Canals began to silt up, reservoirs lost efficiency, and the precise water control that had once been Angkor's greatest strength began to fail at critical points. Small failures in the hydraulic system had amplified consequences. Agricultural production, the foundation of the economy, became less predictable. With fewer surpluses, the ability to sustain large populations and monumental projects declined. This created a cascading effect that impacted both the economy and social stability. At the same time, external factors also began to exert pressure on the empire. Neighboring regions, including emerging kingdoms in what is now Thailand, began to challenge Khmer influence. Military conflicts, even if not constant, demanded resources and attention that had previously been devoted to internal maintenance. Combined, these elements created a scenario of slow but continuous transformation. Angkor did not collapse suddenly. Instead, it underwent a gradual process of adaptation and loss of cohesion. Areas that had once been densely populated began to be abandoned, while others attempted to reorganize around new economic and religious dynamics. The urban system, once highly integrated, began to fragment. The complexity that had enabled the city's rise was now becoming a challenge to its own maintenance. By the end of this period, Angkor was still impressive in scale and appearance, but it no longer operated with the same efficiency and control as before. The city was entering a new phase, one marked not by expansion, but by attempts to adapt to a changing world. And gradually, this process would lead to what came next: the progressive decline of one of the greatest cities in human history. In the centuries that followed, what remained of Angkor entered a phase of irreversible transformation. The decline did not occur as a sudden collapse, but as a slow draining of power, population, and relevance. As the hydraulic system continued to lose efficiency and central authority weakened, the city ceased to function as the dominant center of the Khmer Empire. Gradually, entire areas began to be abandoned. Agricultural fields were no longer maintained. Canals became clogged, and wooden structures disappeared over time, consumed by the tropical vegetation. This process was intensified by external political changes. During the 14th and 15th centuries, neighboring kingdoms, especially the rising kingdom of Ayutthaya, began to exert increasing military pressure on Khmer territories. These conflicts not only drained resources, but also contributed to regional instability. At a certain point, around the 15th century, the political center of the empire was relocated further south, closer to maritime trade routes. This strategic shift marked a definitive turning point. Angkor, which had once been the heart of a continental empire, was no longer its primary seat of power. With the departure of the political and administrative elite, the city lost its central function. Without continuous maintenance of its complex infrastructure, the urban system entered a progressive collapse. What had once been a vibrant metropolis began to transform into a landscape of partially inhabited ruins, with small communities still living among monumental temples that no longer held the same political meaning. Over time, the forest advanced. Trees grew over stone structures, roots penetrated walls and corridors, and much of the city was slowly covered by vegetation. Unlike cities completely destroyed by war or natural disasters, Angkor was simply no longer maintained. And without maintenance, even the greatest human constructions begin to fade. Despite this, not everything was lost. Some temples